Welcome to The Other Worlds, where we talk to authors of fantasy, supernatural, and paranormal stories. Let's open the portal and meet our guest. Hello, my name is Sandra Tan, and I am joined today by Ellie Fowler. Ellie is the talent director for Lucinda Literary Agency. Her fiction features epic healing stories. Book two in the Final Incarnation series, Quest of Prophecy and Origins, came out earlier this year, and the next book, War of Wings and Talons, will be out March 17th, 2026. Ellie, thank you for joining me to chat about your books today.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's wonderful to get an opportunity to dive into these books. And I got to read book one and book two back to back to prepare for this podcast episode. So I have loads of questions that kind of come from both books. And,
Yeah, yeah.
but, to start out, maybe you can share a little bit about why it was that you decided to start writing fantasy.
So I was a 911 dispatcher for years while I worked on my degrees because I was wanting to get into natural medicine, into research. I had an internship at the local hospital where we had an integrative clinic and we were doing research on different integrative medicines and things like that. So I was building up a very different career from being an author, but I love to read a lot of different books, including fantasy. Fantasy is one of my favorite genres. And so in the late 2021, I got sick with the Omicron variant of COVID. And the first week of January 2022, I went back to work and I nearly collapsed at work and they didn't know what was wrong with me. And this is a pretty common thing. You'll sometimes hear it called long COVID, where people have these symptoms that linger. They're not necessarily clear as to what they are. My symptoms included like my heart rate shooting up really high when I would try to stand up and do things. It was just a mess, and I couldn't continue working at clinic. By this point, I had left 911 dispatch, but I had a lot of stress and strain from 911 dispatch that I was dealing with. And then, of course, once this hit with this illness, I couldn't go and work at clinic and I couldn't do the things that I was accustomed to doing day in and day out. And so I started writing nonfiction discussing my work as an herbalist. And the first book I wrote was The Trauma Informed Herbalist, and I self published it. And I self published a couple of other books, and I have a traditionally published book coming out in the end of 2026 on polyvagal theory and herbalism. And so, shocker, I realized I loved writing. And I loved writing books, especially. I loved being able to kind of set out a lot of the material and like the arcs and things. And during this process, I became more stressed about certain things that are going on. Of course, for those of you in the United States, a lot of the turmoil that we've experienced, that was very stressful for me. And then, of course, I had the personal things that I was dealing with and the chronic illness. And I was struggling with that. And my husband was like, "But you like the idea of writing fantasy." I toyed with this idea. And I had Linnea and Darren's story like playing in my mind. Not in the exact form it's in now, but I sometimes like daydream about this world and some of these things. And my husband was like, "Why don't you just use that as almost like an escape mechanism?" And I was like, okay, sure, let me try it. And then I found that I really enjoyed world building and I enjoyed digging deep into like how many of the planets would be visible and therefore how would that inform the different mythologies. And like I really got wrapped up into that for a while and really got to like build what I feel like is a very rich world. And then I started really fleshing the plots out and starting to write. It became a way to express myself in a moment where I was still bedridden most days. And so I think I will always love it because it has been that kind of saving grace coping mechanism for me.
Well, that's fantastic that, that it's had such a personal impact on you in terms of helping with recovery. And
Yeah.
and it's interesting that you mention like the rich world building because you do have this incredible world building in your series. And honestly, I was kind of wondering like if you liked to torture yourself because of the planet system. I mean,
Yeah.
can you,
Yeah.
for people who are new to the books, can you explain a little bit about the planet system?
Okay. So, this is actually, it's funny because at one point I had somebody say, well, why did you make the time frames the way that you make the time frames? And they were like, like you said, why would you torture yourself like that? Why would you do something that crazy? And I said, well, I started thinking about the early drafts, let's back up. The early drafts of the story did not have this level of world building in them. I wrote some of the draft first, and then I took it to my agent and I was like, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And she was like, "This is nice, but this needs a lot more in-depth world building." And I said, bet. Because I was genuinely afraid to do that much world building. I was afraid that people would find it annoying more than they would find it enriching. And so I had really pulled back on what I wanted to do. And then once my agent was like, if you're going to publish this, you need to go back and create more of a world. I went and started with the solar system. And there's a YouTuber named Artifactsian, and he has a fantastic series on how you determine the solar system, how you determine kind of the quote unquote Goldilocks zone, that area that's not too hot, not too cold, that a planet could thrive in based off the size of the sun, or the star that's at the center of that system. And so like I did a lot of those like, really bad math. Okay. If Neil deGrasse Tyson was to look at what I did, he would 100% be like, what is this mess? But there is some plausibility to the way that I set it up. And the two suns in the center of this system rotate around each other perpendicular to the orbit of the planet, which is why the suns change position throughout the book because there's certain times of the year that the red sun, the little sun comes up first. There's other times of the year where you don't see the red sun at all, and then there's times where the the bigger sun comes up first. Yeah, I love that kind of weird nitpicky hyperfixation. I love it. It was so fun to like think about what's theoretically possible. And I mean, we live in a universe that is in a lot of ways infinite, at least to us. We do not know the end of it. And so I like to imagine that somewhere out there in the universe, there's something similar to this that could prove my point someday. But yes, totally just it was a hyper fixation and it was great fun. And I credit Artifactsian for that part of the cycle because I dug into his calculations for the different areas um, that could host a planet, right? So you have two suns. Your planet has to be a lot further away. It can't be where Earth is. So that's where the time came in. Was I this planet's orbit has to be a lot further away from this dual sun system in order for it to be cool enough to house life. And then I started thinking about it and I was like, okay, this is great, but also we're going to have a higher concentration of certain gases, certain greenhouse gases, to allow there to be enough heat so that in the winter months, you're not just freezing life out. And then I had to calculate how much that would be in order to keep the planet warm enough and not too hot in the summers and because it is so much further away from the sun, so it's not getting quite as much radiation as we get. But then I also had to make sure there was still enough oxygen to theoretically, it was so ridiculous the stuff I did. But that's why the plants are purple and blue because there is a thicker atmosphere, and so different wavelengths are hitting the planet, and therefore the plants and the way that they are able to create energy through their version of photosynthesis is slightly different. And so they would need to be a slightly different color. Um, yeah, so that's a long way of saying yes, I'm obsessed with these little little details.
Well, it makes me wonder, like, do you have some sort of, model or mechanism for figuring out where the planet is in relation to the suns at the different times of the year and where you are in the book, and so you don't post that online, you don't share your, this is where we are in our orbit right now.
I should. I hadn't thought I like this is one of those things that like I never know if it's really all that interesting or if this is just some weird obsession I have. But yeah, it's a lot of the times my model consists of me like, okay, if I'm here, where are the sun? Like I'm literally just like sitting here and figuring it out with my fingers. I'm not, yeah, I'm rotating one finger around my other hand and trying to think where the suns would be. But I should absolutely see if I could somehow create some sort of model to show that because I think you're right. I think some people are interested in that kind of thing.
It's a very interesting element to the books. And of course, it affects the daytime and it affects, like, you have all these different, times. You sometimes, when I'm reading a book, I can, oh, here's a list of character names. Okay, whatever. Right. But you actually, like, have all these explanations for, like, how long these different time frames are and everything. And so, like, so here I am. I'm like, oh, take a screenshot and have that on my phone so I can look that up while I'm reading off my Kindle so that I know what this means because it actually does matter and it affects the story and all of those things. So yeah, I'm sure that people would be interested. Bit neat.
Yeah, yeah, and like the fall light versus winter's light and spring light, like those lights change because of where the red sun is. And like at one point the red sun is in front of the yellow sun. So that changes the spectrum of lights that are hitting. And I think you probably see this more where you are than I'm a little further south, and so we don't have quite as clear of a season change. But even here, like sometimes I can look outside in the later summer, early fall, and I can see, like, you can just, there's a certain clarity that the light gets when fall starts coming in. And that got me thinking, like, well, what does this look like on this planet? And that's when I realized, well, the sun would be at a different angle. So even the aurora changes because um, the different wavelengths that would be hitting the aurora will change based on the time of year. Yeah, the whole thing added a whole level of complexity to it that I love because then I can start thinking, how does this change the mythology? How does this change the stories that these people would have told themselves when they were, in a more primitive place? And even now, I mean, the technology in this time is kind of medieval-ish, we'll say. And so even now, they still have a lot of belief around magic and unknown things. And so how does that shape the mythos of the different regions?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the magic because you do it, you didn't just create an interesting planetary system, right? You have an interesting magic system. And uh, uh, there are so many different types of magic that people can have. And of course, not everybody has magic. So,
Right.
so so those things are at play in the story as well. And I'm curious, if you were in this world, what kind of magic do you think you would have?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, when I ask questions like this, I love to ask, what would you like to have and what do you think you would have? Because a lot of the times those are two different things, right? I would love to have flame. The idea of being able to control the heat and the fire and like that side of things. Plus, it kind of creates an affinity for the dragons. So 100%, I love the idea of having flame. The reality is I would probably be more ground. So the dirt, the earth, very much that kind of manifestation energy, that would be where I would end up.
That's where you think you'd end up. Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, and where did you draw your inspiration for your magic system when you were developing it?
Yes, so I love that you asked that because a lot of people, when I start saying, "Oh, it's an elemental system," they're like, "Oh, like Avatar, The Last Airbender." I was like, kind of, but it's more so instead of earth, fire, air, and water, it's a five element system that kind of bases off of some of the very loosely based off of some of the more Eastern, like traditional Chinese medicine systems, where you have five elements. They control each other, but then they also form each other so they can suppress and they can also build up the different um aspects of the other elements. And so I kind of took that and loosely turned it into like, okay, what would this look like in this world? Right? So you're not going to call it Earth because Earth doesn't exist. They're not on planet Earth. So it became ground. It was the ground was and so like I kind of played with it from that angle. I had a friend who is a dungeon master for D&D come over and we did a lot of like how does this look as far as battles, like what how much of a system do we want to make it where X element suppress. So for instance, like your mist element, which is very water based, is it going to always suppress the flame, the fire element? Like, can you just always dump mist on flame and call it a day? And so like what are the little nuances there? So we had a great time playing with that. And a little tidbit that will come into play in Eleanor's series is that these elements, yeah, Eleanor series, these elements actually um, inform the Fey magic. So it informs the plant magic of the Northern Fey. It informs, they don't know it necessarily, like it's kind of an unconscious thing that's happening, but it informs a lot of the ground magic and the way that the dwarves work with the rocks. And so like there's a lot the same elemental features come into play in other magic systems because it is kind of the underlying way that the world works. But it's not necessarily as obvious in those systems. So,
Yeah, well, thanks for that little tidbit there.
yeah, you got real excited about Eleanor's series. Yeah.
Well, it was one of my things that I was thinking about asking you was whether or
Yeah.
not there was going to be a possibility of, going into Eleanor's point of view and getting more of her story. So
Eleanor has a story, Tuthin has a story. Like of all the weird things, Lady Elaine has a story. Like don't I don't know why that's happening, but that's happened. Like I have several stories that I keep there are these plastic boxes that were I think they're technically meant to hold photos because they have these 4x6 plastic holders inside of them, but they're perfect for index cards. And so I have them all labeled for everybody's different stories. And when I have a thought or when I write something and I'm like, oh, this needs to come back up in XYZ stories, I write it on an index card and I stick it in their little holder. And so I've got them all ready to go for when I get a chance to start sketching out the next series.
wow, well, that's fantastic because
Yeah.
I'll be very excited to see where that goes. And on that note, just going right back to the beginning, uh, we have Linnea, who is our main protagonist.
Yes.
And Linnea is a princess, and she has a brother, Aiden, and she has a sister, Eleanor. And so I'm wondering which of the three is most like you.
Ooh. Aiden.
Really?
Yeah. There are definitely obviously every person self-inserts into the characters. And so there are moments where I very much have some of Linnea's logic. And Eleanor is Eleanor has a lot of the pieces. I will say this because if you read the first three chapters and you end there, you're going to be like, what the heck are you talking about? Because Eleanor is such a brat at the beginning. Spoilers, sorry. But Eleanor has a lot of the pieces of personality I wish I had. So as she develops, as you see her come into her own, there's a lot of those pieces where I am writing a lot of what I wish I had, but I relate most to Aiden. I was the eldest. I have a younger sister, but I don't, but like I grew up with all my cousins. So I have several cousins that we were all, it was very Walton's family. For those of you who maybe are younger and don't know, the Waltons family was this like I think 70s TV show where they all lived on a farm together and the grandparents lived there. Like everybody lived in this big house together. And that's very much how I grew up. And um, my parents and I, we had like one part of the house, and then there was a separate apartment where other cousins lived, and my grandparents had the upstairs. And so I grew up as the eldest in that setup where there were several of the younger kids. And so I kind of had that protective piece. And of course, I pick on the youngest one. Let's be real. It's like Aiden and Eleanor have a thing back and forth. So yeah, very much as strange as that is, Aiden very much feels like me. And some of the things that happen to Aiden later on are a little bit of I don't want to say I don't want to say too much. I don't want to spoil it, but there are some moments that it felt like kind of was paralleling some of the chronic illness flare-ups that I was having. So
Yeah, I can see that. Um, I can see where that inspiration would come from. Um, as yeah, we won't delve too deeply into spoilers or anything like that. So,
don't want to
um,
spoil it, but also yeah, it's interesting. But yes, there's a lot of that I like the especially some of the logic, some of the weird moments where she's like, "Well, this is what we're thinking." I can see where that's very much like my thought process sometimes. So
yeah, it's interesting that she is so logical a lot of the time. Like she's a very practical person, and Um, whereas Eleanor, certainly at the beginning for sure, is very emotional.
yeah.
And and so it's interesting to see how they interact and also how that shapes their stories. But I think it doesn't make like Linnea's fascinating and I'm all in. And I got to the end of book two and had a few things to say about you. I'm sorry, but I mean,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. Yeah. So the end of book two is very much a cliffhanger, and it was not planned that way. That it was originally that was almost supposed to just be half of book two. But I had a pretty significant flare up. My grandfather passed away. And so like several things happened all at once. My sister got cancer. And so, like, I was in a situation where I could not edit the second half of the book, and I could not get it to the point where I could get it out. So, yes, major cliffhanger. It was really kind of cruel, but my alpha readers they voted on that being the cliffhanger. There was a couple of other spots that I could have gone a little further, I could have stopped a little sooner. And they said, if you want maximum impact, this is where you end it. So I did, and I think they were right. But yes, definitely a serious drop off. And going back to Eleanor and Linnea and how they are presenting themselves, there are a lot of things about the isolated area of the North where they live that very much kind of I don't want to say um make them seem younger, but there are a lot of ways in which they're not quite as worldly as some of the southern characters. They're just not as aware. I mean, they're in the north. It's a little more isolated. They're not really meeting as many people. There's a little bit of kind of a backwards view in some ways. And so as they start getting into the into Enthor, right, which is where we kind of end up, there's not really like Linnea is making dumb decisions in a lot of ways because her logic works in a very specific cocooned community and it does not work in the wider world. And so there's a lot of moments where I think like I want to strangle her. I think the reader's ready to strangle her. She's making a lot of decisions that are just like, what are you doing? But this is a 4-book series. And like, as you go on and she starts coming into her own and she starts exploring more of this, like, um, what she can do and that there isn't as much control as she thinks there is. And she has a wider understanding of the world in general. Um, I think she becomes less frustrating as a character.
I mean, it's an important aspect of any story that the characters shouldn't be perfect on page one. They should grow, and
Right.
they should face things that are going to force their growth. And you do that with both of those characters. Although we don't spend as much time with Eleanor, certainly not in book one. Um, both of those characters have considerable growth arcs. And that's an important thing to remember, but that's also part of the world building, like you're saying. Like, obviously, things in Aelor are different than things in Enthor, and um, and their level of awareness is different. I mean, I
Mhm.
think about it this way: I grew up in a really small town, and
Right.
good night, John Boy. I know the Waltons.
You
Like,
know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you're talking about because, yeah. So I watched that on TV when I was a kid. So yeah, so when I think about that from that perspective, like obviously growing up and when you're thinking about the level of technology and how you communicate with other nations and whatnot, like obviously that level of awareness is different and that affects your perception. As soon as you
Right.
start traveling, you start to realize things are not always XYZ. Things are sometimes a lot more chaotic or there's a lot of things that you just didn't know about that are
Right.
going to shape how you deal with the situations that you're facing. Now, but one of the things, like, I mean, just to, for the people who aren't familiar with the series, you do have this marriage exchange that
Yeah.
starts, it's the beginning of book one. And I'm wondering where you came up with I mean, obviously it serves the story, but
Right.
where did you come up with the idea for doing this type of marriage exchange with these neighboring nations?
I, I am sure that there is inspiration from another book I've read somewhere in that. Um, I'm sure of it, but I don't know where it originated. That was part of the original story. And it was very much based off of some of the back. So when I did the world building for the actual planet itself. And I began determining where the continents would be and where the fault lines would be and how the continents would move and kind of create the world that we now see. Then I kind of created where the humans would have come from, where the Fae would have come from, how those migration patterns worked, which helps me with the languages that I build. Um, yes, I'm a wannabe Tolkien, I know, but like, so there was a lot of these things that came into play. And then I had to sit down and say, where were the wars? Like, where were the big wars? And how did that work out? And why did it work the way that it worked? And so that is where the understanding of this marriage exchange changed from just like because original in the original story this marriage exchange was just going to be kind of a basic like they were going to demand the princess and that was the end of it. But the reason that this came the way that it did is because the Aelorian king at the time realized we have to do something to stop Enthor from swallowing us up. Because at the time that this exchange came into being, Enthor was a much bigger power than it is now. And they were doing a little bit of what Sarathor is now doing. Sarathor is kind of conquering. They are trying to build out and trying to take over more and more of the human lands. And so at the time, Enthor was kind of that power. And in order to try to maintain their independence, because the king at the time realized that it was going to be horrendous for his people, the culture shock of having to adopt all of these things. Like, he was just trying to protect his people, and he says, well, instead of you taking us over, why don't we become quote unquote allies and begin exchanging groups of nobles, so that essentially the nobles all kind of become family. So if you do this for a couple of hundred years, you end up with a lot of nobles in Enthor that are, you know, they're in Aelor now, and vice versa. And so then I was kind of like, well, how does this work? Like, logically, how does this work? You can't have the men having to disappear to other areas. So that's why the women have to go back, because these both of these cultures are very like male property owned, like men own most of the property, blah blah blah. So it doesn't make sense for the women to stay put because these are patriarchal societies. So you have the women having to move to the other country. And so that's kind of where that came from. There is a reason that Enthor agreed to that. Oh, it's okay. It's the Hannibal issue. So like a lot of the big great conquerors would have these horrendous marches in Europe, right? They'd have these horrendous marches in the middle of winter, and people would like either desert or die off, or because of the conditions. And so the Enthorian king came up against that and tried to go to Aelor. And remember, the seasons, this comes into play with the whole time thing, right? The seasons are effectively a year long. So they're an Earth year long. So you have winter for a full, effectively 12 Earth months. And so they were trying to attack before winter came. Winter comes a little early, and now the army is beginning to die off, and the man realizes it's going to be very difficult to conquer Aelor because they are so isolated. So this was like his way of keeping his pride intact and acting like he was being gracious and giving Aelor their independence in a way. So that's kind of the ancient backstory to how that came into being. And it's interesting because, like, really and truly, the fact that for those of you who haven't read the book, the premise is that Linnea is trying to not end up in this marriage exchange. She feels like it would be better for her to be in Aelor because of the threat that's coming from other nations. And so she's trying to both hide her power so that she doesn't become a target, while also trying to like keep her head down so that she doesn't end up being shipped off to Enthor. And of course that does not work out for her. But those rules and a little bit of the flexing that happens there is just typical for those kinds of people in power. They're gonna find ways to make exceptions for their daughters in ways that they wouldn't necessarily do for the other nobles.
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma that she finds herself in, and of course, the discovery of her power and how that impacts, is the catalyst for the story,
Right.
and how that affects Eleanor's um, match at the marriage exchange. Of course, are significant.
Yeah.
So, without again, without giving too much away,
All
it is
right.
the beginning of book one, but at the same time, go experience it for yourself because whew, the way that things twist and turn pretty quickly, and
Yeah.
how that sets up things that pay off even well into book two. Like yeah. So it was a very, very interesting thing to experience coming into the story, and because it wasn't something that I had seen done before, so it was intriguing. So, and it's a good, you're right, because when, once you start having these interconnected families,
Mhm.
obviously it does sort of shift loyalties.
Yeah.
So, but speaking of loyalties, you also have this group in the books, the Knights of Felorian.
Yes,
They really don't have loyalty to any nation.
they don't. They don't.
So, how are they getting away with that?
Um, quite clever, quite clever tactics. I mean, obviously, they have learned to balance between different nation requirements. We are going to find out in book three that it doesn't always go as well as it seems on the surface. Um, but both Darren and the the head Norio have ties to different nations that they are using to their advantage to try to um, keep everybody agreeing that the knights can be autonomous, and it hasn't always worked out. Um, yeah, it's complex. I would just say it's complex, and they do have, it was kind of built off the Knights Templar, not exactly. Like, I don't, if you know what the Knights Templar is, and you've read the book, you're like, well, that doesn't really, but it was kind of built off of that, and the idea that they do have a lot of stores of finances that kind of keep them from getting buried under somebody's power. But then they also have people like Darren and Norio who have these connections that can kind of play off those connections to keep everybody sated and feeling like they're not a real threat to the powers that be. But again, in book three, we find out it's not working as well as they are trying to play it off that it is.
That's going to be interesting. I can't wait to see what happens in book three. So,
Yeah.
uh, one of the things that I was curious about in the book, obviously, secrets are a very big part of the book and have a very big impact on some of the characters' relationships. And
Yeah.
I was wondering, did any of your characters have secrets that they kept from you that surprised you and sort of changed things in the
Yeah.
story? And is there one
Oh
that
yeah.
it's an example of, or
Um, Lady Elaine was not supposed to be who she's ended up being. So Lady Elaine was absolutely supposed to be a write-off character pretty early on. And the fact she ends up being so important in book two and now has her own story was very much something that I did not realize was happening. And for anybody who has not done a lot of like that kind of creative work, or my mom's an artist and she says this happens with paintings where she'll be working on a painting and all of a sudden a piece of the painting will shift away she wasn't expecting it to, and then she just has to paint it that way because it's where it's going. That very much happens in writing as well. You'll be writing characters and you'll get in an argument with a character. I had an argument with Darren one day and I was like, this is really awful and embarrassing, but like that can't happen right now because of the plot. Like, please just do this. And I forced it to happen the way I needed it to happen, and it did not work as well as if I'd gone how he wanted. But if I had gone the way that he was wanting to go, it would totally change everything in the third and fourth books, and I couldn't do that. Um, so there are moments where they like you just like you're having them walk down a path and they turn down a different path, and all of a sudden you're doing something different than what you expected. Um, and that's fun. It's exciting to get to see that kind of thing happen, but also it's a little scary because I'm a planner. I very much like to plan and have my arcs ready to go. And so learning how to balance that, balance the arcs that I want and the arcs that will make sense for the story and the emotional beats we're trying to hit, alongside those spontaneous moments that can really bring out some very interesting pieces. That's been hard for me. I mean, like I said, I came from a nonfiction book background. I'm accustomed to setting an outline, writing the thing, and then handing it out and going, here, y'all enjoy. So this is very new for me. Um, And yeah, and that's part of I think why I enjoy this so much is there is an exploration that is just as much part of that subconscious as it is the conscious decisions I've made while writing.
Well, it's interesting that you say that you argue with Darren because that's probably what's coming through then in the books because there's these moments where he seems to be kind of at war with himself.
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
he wants to do one thing and mm,
Yeah. He is,
and the worst
yeah.
thing is like we're all like, what is your problem? And then of course we get to the end of
Yeah.
it and we're like, oh,
Oh, that's your problem. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting thing for me because I know a lot about reader trust, right? Like you have to have a certain level of rapport built with your reader if you're going to have them hang on like that. And I didn't do that as well as I should have. But for those of you who haven't read book one, like if you stick with it, you get into book two, and it's the in the Big Bang Theory, there's this gif that goes around of Sheldon where he's like, why? And then he flips the page and then he goes, oh, that's why. Like, that's very much, I get that from my alpha readers a lot. That particular scene very much, I think explains my writing style when it came to this book.
well, some things do have to, be held back for those moments. And I mean, on that note, I'll just say I'm very curious to see how, what he's going to do with the shovel that he needs to have at the beginning of book three. Because,
Yeah.
there's a lot going on. So,
Yeah,
but
it's very interesting because Linnea's descent. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to ruin it, but like Linnea's descent was originally going to be part of book three. It wasn't going to be part of book two, but that was a moment where that changed because of the response that occurs to that cliffhanger, Linnea's specific response to that cliffhanger, and her descent had to occur before that response. So moments like that are really interesting for me because like I don't know, like I really wasn't expecting to have to do that where I did, and but it's worked out really well. And and yes, Darren is angsty and he's warring with himself, but it is a real threat. It's not fake. It's not something where it is a real threat.
yeah, no, he hasn't manufactured things.
Right. A lot of people were like, I feel like this is fake. It's like, no, actually it really like it is, yeah, it's a problem. And it's going to become a bigger problem before it resolves.
Yeah, well, as the way it is with most
As we do.
like so I mean I found, the stories just fascinating and I love the characters. Of course, there's a lot of characters, there are a lot of things going on. So I'm really curious to see where you go with all of these side stories as well with Eleanor um and with uh,
Yeah, that's yeah. So Eleanor's story and Mariel's story, those are very much things. So that's what's going to be so interesting about the third book is we do have three storylines that are kind of braided together because Eleanor and Mariel both have to discover certain things in order for the final battle to work the way it needs to in the fourth book. So we actually get their stories on the side as well as what's happening with Linnea and Darren. And it becomes very much a multi POV book, which is kind of strange because then the fourth book is back mostly in Linnea's perspective. But I think it works because you are discovering these different pieces that if you didn't have them, it's that's not something I can just quickly be like, oh, by the way, blah blah blah. And of course, some of the relationships that people are curious about will be resolved in book three and will help us to see where this was supposed to go or wasn't supposed to go. So
oh, well, I am curious about that too. So that's yeah, you're giving us so much to look forward to. And and how many months is it until March?
I know it's 6 months. It's 6 months. We're almost there, I promise.
Months. Oh my goodness.
And I do hope to have book four. I don't want to make any promises on exactly when, but I do hope to have book four out pretty fast after book three. Me having to write this polyvagal theory book for my herbalism contract is why there wasn't another book this fall. So I am hoping that books 3 and 4 can come out pretty close together so that everybody can kind of get that resolution, and be able to see that full arc because it's exciting.
Well, fingers crossed that that works out. Now, you also have something on called Sunday Side Quests. Tell us a little bit about Sunday Side Quests as we wrap things up.
Yeah, so Sunday Side Quests is the backstory for my brain just stopped. Hang on. For Verilon and Althea. So Verilon and Althea are Linnea's parents. And it's their story, which is going to eventually be a duology. And if you sign up for it every Sunday, you get like the next chapter of their story. So
Okay, so anybody can go to your website and sign up for Sunday Side Quests and
yep.
get to see some of that in the early stages.
Yeah, and the bonus chapters, you can sign up on the website and get the bonus chapters as well. Book one's bonus chapters are out. Book two's bonus chapters are coming. So that will be, and so if you sign up and get book one's bonus chapters, when book two's release, I send those to the email list. So you'll get those as well.
Fantastic. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me about your books today and the series and to give us some hints about what we can look forward to.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for being here.